Hi, everybody!
When it comes to media franchises, everyone's favorite Double O agent is one of the most enduring characters. Debuting in the 1953 novel Casino Royale, Ian Fleming's character would go on to establish a cinematic universe less than 10 years later, with 1962's Dr. No. It's thanks to these cinematic outings comprising of 25 films and 6 actors that we've had a small collection of James Bond video games. I'm excluding the 1967 Casino Royale starring David Niven in the role, as that's more of a parody film and it was a non-Eon based production. But it's thanks to those books and films over the years we now find ourselves in the situation the James Bond franchise is currently in. No actor cast in the role, developmental hell for the next film project, and a rather long wait between entries. Were this any other franchise, it'd be deader than the dads Christian Cage routinely attacks on AEW TV. But James Bond is different. The character is malleable and can be a blunt instrument used in any way a writing staff sees fit. However, it's for the very fact the cinematic franchise is currently dormant that 007 First Light is going to be such an important piece of media for the franchise. And it's partially why IO Interactive is going to need to hit a home run with the first entry in a planned trilogy. So let's discuss that in more detail. But first, I have a couple of messages to pass along before we do. First up, I want to cover an exciting piece of news. A couple of days ago, I was invited to be part of the IO Interactive Creator Program, which means you're going to see a lot more 007 First Light content in the very near future, some of which is going to be coverage of exclusive events held by the company, which is pretty damn cool. Part of that coverage will be in hopes I can earn enough points to get a review copy of the game, which I'm desperately hoping happens, as this is one of my most anticipated games of 2026. If you have any games you're hotly anticipating next year, please tell me in the comments section, as I really want to hear about them. But anyways, to get a review code, I have to accumulate points, and you, the audience members, can also help out with that by interacting with and sharing my First Light content as much as possible. So if you could do that, it'd be greatly appreciated. Just like the next part of the message. Currently, we're on the road to 2,000 subscribers, and I really want to hit that milestone by Christmas. So if you want to help me reach my goals, then mash the subscribe button, so I won't have to act like a Bondian villain. I may be a heel, but I have some class. Anyways, back to the video. So this first point I want to discuss is always an issue for any series that is long running. Where the hell do newcomers actually start off? Generally speaking, this is one of the strengths for the James Bond franchise. Up until the Daniel Craig era of films, these movies were effectively just episodic in nature, requiring none or virtually zero knowledge of the character or settings beforehand. You could just jump into any of the films and do okay. The same could pretty much be said of the novels and short stories. There may have been little references here or there that were neat little callbacks, but nothing earth-shattering. This changed somewhat with the Craig films, as there was a slight narrative throughout his entire run. But you're generally speaking okay to jump in with any of them and be in for a good time. But with the title role currently vacated and no clear release date in mind for the next film, Bond's having a dry spell for once in his life. This is where IO Interactive come in. Announced about 5 years ago as Project 007, First Light looks to be a great entryway for the younger audience to experience the character possibly for the first time. Generally speaking, video games are now the easiest entry point for someone to get into a character or a piece of media. This is thanks to gaming now accounting for more revenue than television, films, music, and comic books, making games the king of media. Yes, that was a Yu-Gi-Oh reference, since they were always talking about the king of games in the anime. Internet boomer reference aside, I think this is a really important thing for the Bond franchise, because the audience ever since the 2010s has been skewing older and older, which is kind of the same issue the franchise faced in 1995 when GoldenEye released. That film and its video game tie-in for the Nintendo 64 opened Bond up for a whole new audience. Now, I know some people will rightfully point out Roger Moore's rather campy interpretation of Bond did open the audience to younger individuals, but you have to keep in mind Moore's final film was in 1985 with A View to a Kill, which would be followed up by a gritty reboot of the character audiences just weren't ready for. so Timothy Dalton's films were not viewed all that favorably. Pierce Brosnan's time as the character was a mix of cheesy camp and legitimately slick action set pieces that were innovative for their time, so it did find a sort of middle ground, even though Die Another Day did pretty much kill off the franchise for a number of years. But this is where a video game can really fill in a gap. We know the game will at minimum be a teen rating, maybe even pushing into the mature range. But we all know kids will find their way to playing and consuming media they probably shouldn't, either because tired parents don't do their research, or because the parents feel their children can actually handle it. But Bond can kind of slot into that gateway point between a T and M rating, because at its core, the franchise can be campy and over the top, and at other times it can be gritty and grounded. If the game can find the middle point, it'll be ideal for newcomers, as some younger people can safely play it, yet it'll still be enjoyable for the grumpy edgelords who hate everything. I know I've babbled it a little, but that was to illustrate the point. Bond is not only flexible as a character, but also flexible as who it's intended for, which is important to getting younger blood into the franchise, which is sorely needed. Once a series is dominated by mostly older individuals consuming the product, it stops appearing cool to a younger audience, which makes it much harder for something to continue on. Given games are cool with everyone at this point, it's probably the perfect medium to get new fans onboarded, which will in turn bolster the numbers of future films, as young people will have a preconceived notion as to whether they like the idea of James Bond or not. For this next point, I'll be comparing IO Interactive's take on the character with not just the Daniel Craig era films, but also with a video game series. When I mention the Craig films, what do you think of? Looking at his first two outings, which take place pretty much directly after each other, we see Bond going from a hot-headed agent who just got his license to kill. Then, as the series goes into his third outing onwards, we see a quieter character who's more established in his role and is closer to retirement. This character progression allowed newcomers to the series a chance to grow with the character. If we're going off my own experience, I almost hated James Bond because my first experience with the character was a rather sour one. I started with Die Another Day when I was still a sensitive to violence pre-teen, so I was already not the biggest fan of going to see the film, as I knew it was going to be too violent for me. But I was going as part of a friend's birthday party, so I didn't really have much choice. The movie itself was also not that good, so I really wasn't a fan, and I didn't understand why the character was so beloved. Despite hearing from my parents I was going to have a great time. When 2006 rolled around, I was a vastly different individual, and I was quite literally ready for the experience, because I had grown into a stage where I was ready for the character. I was also a hot-headed teenager, because I'd had a number of shitty experiences within those 6 years between films, so I could actually see aspects of myself within Bond. This would endear me to the character, and I was hooked. I would later go back and visit the Bond films my parents enjoyed so much, and I understood the appeal. Then, as more of the Craig films came out, I was also at different points in my life, and each one resonated with me because of that. With a film franchise, that's all well and good, but does it work when it comes to video games? Yes, it actually does. Hear me out on this one. When the PlayStation 2 rolled out in the year 2000, PlayStation had established itself not just an older fanbase with things like Resident Evil, but a younger audience as well with colorful mascot platformers like Crash and Spyro. So they doubled down on the mascot platformer aspect. During the PS2, you had Jak and Daxter from Naughty Dog, Ratchet and Clank from Insomniac Games, and the Sly Cooper series from Sucker Punch Productions. Of the three series, only Ratchet and Clank still gets brand new games. But of the three, I want to highlight Jak and Daxter, for one simple reason. It's relevant to the character progression and the audience growing into the character aspects I mentioned earlier. For the first game, Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy, Naughty Dog stuck to the make it accessible to all philosophy, which works so well to establish Crash Bandicoot as a household name. The first Jak and Daxter game did so well enough to become a greatest hits title, eventually. But Naughty Dog higher-ups took note of the feedback from the kids, who were now entering their teens. They said the first Jak game was cool for their little brothers. The developers would take this message to heart. Jak 2, which came in 2003, exactly 2 years after the first game. Gone were the colorful Saturday morning cartoon aesthetics, and in its place was a darker color palette and guns in place of magic powers. Naughty Dog's reasoning for this was they wanted to start shifting towards games their audience could grow with. This trend would continue into the PlayStation 3 era, where they went with more of a popcorn action flick type of deal with Uncharted and a nihilistic dark type of deal with The Last of Us. At this point in time, Naughty Dog have established themselves as making mature games for gamers who are adults, meaning they've now discarded any intention of making games for all ages. The PlayStation brand now skews older, which is a topic I've previously covered in a video called The PlayStation Problem. But like I said previously, this is kind of what IO Interactive are probably going for with their planned James Bond trilogy. During this series, we start off just like the Daniel Craig era films, a hot-headed agent who will cool with time. This will probably allow players to grow with this version of Bond, and it'll be interesting to see, as it'll probably take at least a decade for the second and third games to come out. Meaning the next two games could be mid to late cycle PS6 games, unless my prediction of gaming generations lasting longer comes true, in which case the second game could be a very late PS5 release and the third entry in the trilogy could be a PS6 game. But either way, some of the teenagers who are getting into the series now thanks to First Light could find themselves staring down middle age by the time the trilogy concludes. So my third reason as to why this game is going to end up being important for the Bond character comes down to it redefining an icon. As I said previously in the video, James Bond is all about changing as a character to fit the times. Think back to each of the most iconic takes on the character. During the Sean Connery era, Bond was established as being a smooth ladies' man and being physically imposing whilst delivering dry wit. Roger Moore cranked the smooth ladies' man aspect of the character up to 11 and incorporated more of Bond's techier gadgets and some of the at times campier elements, making for what I feel is the most fun interpretation of Bond to date. The Dalton era films bring Bond closest to his novel counterpart. He also pretty much works as a prototype for what the Daniel Craig version would become, so we can kind of lump those two together. I'd argue the Pierce Brosnan version of the character was kind of an amalgamation of the Connery, Moore, and Dalton eras, and proved Bond could still work after being on screen for 30 years. With this game, IO Interactive now have the chance to define what could make the next Bond by utilizing the previously established tropes, flipping them on their head, using them as is, or adding new wrinkles to the formula, all of which potential writers can draw upon, which is just super exciting. I definitely noticed the developers are leaning more into the Roger Moore era tropes, at least so far, as this version of Bond is playful, quippy, and actually utilizes more gadgets than some of the other iterations of the character, which for me is super exciting, since I get a lot of enjoyment from whenever Bond leans into the gadgets, as I covered in my wishlist video. But those were just some of the things I feel will make this entry important for the franchise going forward. Do you think there's anything I missed? Also, who's your favorite version of James Bond? If you've made it this far into the video, you're going to love either my wishlist video or my video discussing why First Light is cinematic gaming done right. So check one of those out, and until next time, keep blazing that trail.